Have you ever looked back at a relationship and realized the warning signs were there all along? Not the obvious signs, not the dramatic arguments, not the suspicious text messages. I'm talking about the subtle psychological shifts that happen long before betrayal becomes visible. The most painful part of being cheated on isn't always the act itself. It's the realization that your intuition was trying to tell you something, but you ignored it. You trusted the words while missing the behavior. You listened to the promises while overlooking the emotional distance. Have you ever noticed how some of the most damaging forms of manipulation don't come through shouting, anger, or obvious lies? They come disguised as confidence. They come wrapped in a sentence that sounds reasonable on the surface. You're just being insecure. Now, to be fair, insecurity is a real human emotion. Every person experiences it at some point. Sometimes fears are irrational, and sometimes concerns have nothing to do with a partner's behavior. But the psychological problem begins when this phrase is used not to solve an issue, but to silence it. When someone genuinely cares about a relationship, they usually want to understand why their partner feels uncomfortable. They ask questions, they provide reassurance, they work toward clarity. Even if they disagree with the concern, they still acknowledge the emotion behind it. That's what emotionally healthy communication looks like. But when a person repeatedly responds with, "You're just being insecure," something different may be happening. Instead of addressing the behavior that raised concern, they redirect attention toward the person expressing it. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about what happened. It's about whether you're emotionally stable enough to question it. Psychologically, this creates confusion. Human beings rely on both evidence and intuition when evaluating situations. You notice small changes in behavior, a shift in tone, less enthusiasm, increased secrecy, a feeling that something isn't quite right. You may not have concrete proof, but your mind begins collecting subtle signals. When those observations are instantly dismissed as insecurity, you start doubting your own judgment. Over time, this self-doubt can become dangerous. You stop asking questions because every concern is met with criticism. You begin editing your thoughts before speaking them out loud. Instead of evaluating the other person's behavior, you focus entirely on fixing yourself. The result is that your attention moves away from what may actually be happening. What's fascinating about human psychology is that people often trust confidence more than facts. If someone responds strongly enough, calmly enough, or repeatedly enough, we begin assuming they must be right. This is why many people ignore their instincts for months. They convince themselves that they're overthinking, being paranoid, or imagining problems that don't exist. The real lesson is not to become suspicious of everyone. It's to understand that healthy relationships make room for honest conversations. A caring partner doesn't punish curiosity. They don't make you feel guilty for seeking clarity. They recognize that trust grows when concerns are addressed, not dismissed, and when words consistently discourage questions rather than encourage understanding. That's a pattern worth paying attention to, because genuine transparency has nothing to fear from honest communication. One of the most misunderstood realities of human psychology is that major betrayals rarely begin with major actions. They often start with small emotional shifts that seem harmless at first. That's why the phrase, "they're just a friend," can sometimes become so significant, not because friendship is wrong, but because people often underestimate the power of emotional connection. Friendships are a normal and healthy part of life. Every strong relationship should allow both partners to have meaningful connections with other people. The issue is not the existence of a friendship. The issue is what role that friendship begins to play emotionally. Human beings naturally gravitate toward people who make them feel understood, appreciated, and valued. When someone is going through stress, boredom, frustration, or emotional dissatisfaction, they may find comfort in conversations with another person. At first, those interactions appear completely innocent. There are no romantic intentions. There are no obvious boundaries being crossed. It simply feels good to talk to someone who listens. But psychology shows that emotional attachment often develops gradually. It doesn't announce itself. It grows through repeated interactions, shared experiences, inside jokes, private conversations, and emotional vulnerability. The more personal information two people exchange, the stronger the emotional bond becomes. What begins as casual communication can slowly transform into something much deeper. The reason many people miss this process is because they focus only on physical behavior. They assume that if nothing romantic has happened, then there is nothing to worry about. However, emotional investment often occurs long before physical attraction becomes obvious. In many cases, a person starts sharing thoughts, feelings, and experiences with someone outside the relationship that they no longer share with their partner. This creates a subtle shift in emotional priorities. The excitement that once existed inside the relationship begins moving elsewhere. The person starts looking forward to messages from the friend. They seek validation from them. They become emotionally dependent on those interactions. Even if they don't consciously recognize what's happening, their emotional energy is gradually being redirected. What makes this situation especially complicated is that many people genuinely believe they are doing nothing wrong. Human beings are experts at rationalizing their behavior. They tell themselves that it's only friendship. They focus on the absence of physical intimacy while ignoring the growing emotional attachment. This allows them to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about their feelings. The strongest warning sign is usually not the friendship itself, but the secrecy surrounding it. When conversations become hidden, when details are withheld, or when a partner becomes unusually defensive about a specific person, it often indicates that the relationship carries more emotional importance than they are willing to admit. Trust is not damaged by friendships. Trust is damaged when transparency disappears. Healthy friendships can exist comfortably in the open because there is nothing to hide. But when emotional intimacy with someone else begins replacing emotional intimacy within the relationship, the danger is no longer the friendship itself. The danger is that an emotional connection has started occupying a space that once belonged to the partnership. And by the time most people notice that shift, the attachment has often become far stronger than anyone expected. Few phrases create more confusion in a relationship than, "I need space." On the surface, it sounds completely reasonable. Every human being needs time to think, recharge, and maintain a sense of individuality. Healthy relationships are not built on constant closeness. In fact, psychology shows that personal space can strengthen emotional bonds when it is used in a healthy way. The challenge is that not all distance serves the same purpose. There is a significant difference between someone creating temporary space to improve themselves and someone creating distance because their emotional investment is fading. The words may sound identical, but the behavior surrounding them is often very different. When a person genuinely needs space, they usually remain emotionally connected. They communicate their needs clearly. They explain what they're dealing with. They reassure their partner that the relationship is still important to them. Even if they spend less time together for a while, their emotional presence remains consistent. Their care, respect, and effort do not suddenly disappear. But when emotional disengagement begins, the request for space can sometimes become a convenient explanation for withdrawal. Instead of bringing two people closer through understanding, it gradually creates a wall between them. Communication becomes less frequent. Conversations lose their warmth. Messages become shorter. Affection decreases. The sense of connection that once felt natural begins to feel forced. Psychologically, human beings invest their attention where their emotions are strongest. This is one of the most reliable principles of behavior. People naturally make time for what excites them, interests them, and feels emotionally rewarding. When someone starts becoming emotionally distant, their priorities often shift without them openly acknowledging it. What's particularly difficult is that this change usually happens gradually. There is rarely a dramatic announcement. Instead, it appears through a series of small adjustments. A person who once wanted to share every detail of their day suddenly becomes private. Someone who eagerly sought connection begins avoiding meaningful conversations. Plans become less frequent. Emotional availability becomes unpredictable. Because these changes occur slowly, many partners convince themselves that nothing is wrong. They assume stress is the cause. They believe things will return to normal next week or next month. They continue waiting for the version of the relationship they remember, even as the emotional reality continues changing. Another important psychological factor is avoidance. Many people struggle with difficult conversations. Rather than openly discussing their changing feelings, they create distance and hope the problem resolves itself. Asking for space can feel easier than admitting confusion, dissatisfaction, or emotional detachment. It allows them to avoid confrontation while gradually pulling away. This is why actions matter more than words. The phrase itself is not the warning sign. Plenty of healthy relationships survive periods of temporary distance. The real question is what happens during that distance. Is there still effort? Is there still communication? Is there still emotional connection? Because genuine space creates room for growth while preserving the bond. Emotional withdrawal does the opposite. It slowly weakens the connection until one person feels increasingly alone in a relationship that technically still exists. And when that pattern continues long enough, the distance becomes more than physical. It becomes emotional, which is often far more difficult to repair. Perhaps one of the most frustrating experiences in any relationship is sensing that something has changed while constantly being told that everything is exactly the same. Human beings are naturally wired to detect emotional shifts. Long before we can explain what feels different, our minds begin noticing subtle changes in behavior, communication, and energy. That's why the phrase, "nothing has changed," can become so psychologically powerful when it directly contradicts what a person is experiencing. Relationships are built on patterns. Over time, people become familiar with each other's habits, tone of voice, expressions, and emotional responses. You learn how someone acts when they're excited, stressed, happy, or distant. This familiarity allows you to notice even the smallest deviations. A person may still say all the right words, but their behavior begins telling a completely different story. Maybe conversations no longer feel engaging. Maybe affection becomes less natural. Maybe they seem distracted when you're together. Perhaps they stop asking questions about your life, your goals, or your day. None of these changes seem dramatic on their own, but collectively they create a feeling that something important has shifted. The psychological challenge begins when those observations are repeatedly denied. Instead of acknowledging the difference, the other person insists that everything is normal. This creates an internal conflict. Your eyes are seeing one reality, but your ears are hearing another. As a result, you begin questioning your own perception. Psychologists often refer to this type of experience as a form of reality conflict. When people receive information that contradicts what they clearly observe, they experience uncertainty. They stop trusting their instincts and start searching for alternative explanations. Maybe they're imagining things. Maybe they're overthinking. Maybe they're being too sensitive. Over time, this self-questioning can become exhausting. Instead of evaluating the other person's actions objectively, all the focus shifts inward. The person begins analyzing their own reactions rather than examining the behavior that triggered those reactions in the first place. What's interesting about human behavior is that genuine emotional changes are extremely difficult to hide completely. Someone may control their words, but controlling every action is much harder. Interest, enthusiasm, attention, and emotional investment naturally reveal themselves through daily behavior. A person who is deeply engaged in a relationship tends to show it consistently. Likewise, a person whose emotional focus is changing often reveals that shift through decreased effort, reduced presence, and declining involvement. This is why actions are usually more reliable than explanations. Words can be carefully chosen. Behaviors are often unconscious. They reveal priorities, emotional investment, and genuine feelings over time. The most important lesson is that no single change proves betrayal, dishonesty, or a hidden problem. People go through stressful periods, emotional struggles, and personal challenges that can temporarily affect their behavior. However, when a consistent pattern of distance exists, and that pattern is continually denied despite obvious evidence, it's worth paying attention. Trust should never require ignoring reality. Healthy relationships allow both people to discuss changes openly, even uncomfortable ones, because honesty doesn't demand that someone stop noticing what they see. Real honesty invites those observations into the conversation and addresses them with openness rather than denial.